I wanted to start with an introduction of myself, but that was already done just now. Just a bit more background. I'm a researcher, PhD candidate at the University of Amsterdam. We study gambling disorder and digital and innovative treatment approaches. Also therapist. I've worked in addiction for quite a few years. Seen a lot of people on the far side of the problem gambling disorder spectrum. So that's the background. I'm here today to talk to you about problem gambling topologies and tailored interventions, as was just mentioned. Now, I am a researcher, so I'm used to giving presentations of at least an hour, so I'll try to keep it concise here. Wanted to start off with a bit of a quiz. I'll go through it quickly, since you're all very intelligent people. There are no prizes to be won here, so you don't have to shout out loud or anything, but just try to participate. So my question to you would be, what is it that these people have in common? That's enough time to think. Obviously, they're all happy, but they're also gambling at the moment. My follow-up question would be, what differentiates these people? What are the differences between these three people? Now, again, you're smart people, so I won't linger too long here, but obviously there's a lot of differences to be recognized here. So the point I'm trying to make here is that not all gamblers are equal. I mean, not all problem gamblers, but all gamblers in general are not equal. But how do we differentiate between them in a meaningful manner? I mean, just looking back at the pictures we just saw, there's a lot of ways to differentiate between the people. I mean, one was male, two were female, but is that really informative for anything that we're trying to do here? So that would be your first question that I would hope that will be answered by the end of the lecture or the presentation. The second question is, why would we even go through the trouble? Like, what are the benefits to us? Now, obviously, not all gamblers are equal. This is known to most of you, probably. But then on the other side of the spectrum, I mean, we've been employing machine learning and creating algorithms to differentiate between gamblers, creating player journeys and player profiles, primarily so far for promotional purposes. But is this actually something that we can use to promote safe play and prevent escalation into problem gambling? Oh, another thing, important thing I think important to note is that we also want to be aware of the black box problem. So obviously we have ways to differentiate between gamblers, but we need to know what is actually happening in this process. So just a quick, well, that didn't go that well, but mainly two topics. So one, subtyping gamblers. What options do we have? What do we know so far from research and clinical knowledge experience? And then a small bridge to tailored intervention. So once we do know how to differentiate gamblers, what can we actually do with that knowledge in promoting safe play and preventing, again, problem gambling? As a side note, by the way, I will mainly use the term problem gambling as opposed to gambling disorder. That's mainly reserved for clinical phenomena. And I want to take this as broad as possible, basically. So it may or may not surprise you, but in clinical practice and in research, there is not really an agreed upon way to categorize or subtype gamblers. I mean, in the DSM that we have, we are allowed to actually categorize based on severity. So low, medium, high, severe problem gamblers based on the problems they experience from their gambling, but that's basically it. Even worse, we provide them with the same treatment. So there's not much differentiation going on there. If you look into research, so I mean, there's a bit of debate, but there's no lack of propositions of frameworks to subtype gamblers. basically, a lot of these frameworks can be brought back to three broad categories of subtyping gamblers. One is based on severity of the gambling problems. The other one is based on the game type preference. And the third one is a more complicated method of subtyping, which is more of a developmental way approach. I'll talk a bit about all of them. So the first one would be to categorize or subtype gamblers based on severity of the problems that they experience from their gambling. Now, it was long thought that gambling disorder, problem gambling, is a gradual slope towards problem gambling. But more and more research actually indicates that it's not really a gradual slope, but it's a slope that follows escalation points. So basically, you end up with three broad types of problem gamblers based on severity. So that's the low-level problem gambler, the at-risk problem gambler, and the problem gambler. That will be the end stage of it. And what we see is that what differentiates the first two groups is chasing losses. So going back to the casino the next day to win back the money that you lost the previous evening or night. And then what separates the latter two groups is a loss of control. So there is a bit more information in that we can actually work with, but it is quite limited because this only mainly focus on the far side of the problem gambling spectrum, gamblers that already experience problems. And it doesn't really explain why these gamblers differ. I mean, we see different problems, but why do they differ? A second framework for subtyping gamblers would be to look at the game type preference. So a very good example is looking at gamblers who play games of luck or chance versus gamblers who mainly play games of skill or strategy. So that would be, well, it's the other way around the pictures, but it will be a slot machine player versus a poker player. Or you could look at the way gamblers actually play. So is it online? Is it land-based? Is it mixed? And actually, if you look at the data, then these two groups appear to be distinct. So there's a lot of variables that differ between these groups as well. So gamblers that play luck-based games in general are more often female, more often a bit older. But there is also much overlap in between these groups. So it doesn't explain as much as we would like to. There's this problem that the most problematic gamblers actually tend to play multiple games, and they don't stick to these categories here, or they play via multiple modes. So that is a bit of a complicating factor. And then again, this framework mainly explains, describes what we see, what differences we see. It doesn't really explain why these differences occur. So a third framework would be a developmental pathways framework. Now, this is mainly like the most known model in this group is the pathways model by Blazinski and Noer. It's 20th anniversary this year. They propose three distinct pathways from which a gambler can actually escalate towards problem gambling. I have a slide in here which explains everything, but that might be a bit too much for now. But basically, what can be derived from this model is that there is three subtypes of gamblers. Behaviorally conditioned gambler, emotional vulnerable gambler, and the impulsivist problem gambler. Now, the most interesting aspect, I think, about this model is that it's a developmental model. So it doesn't just describe what we see at one time point, but it actually explains how someone got there. It takes into account personal characteristics, even before one started playing or gambling. Again, I have a picture here, so this is everything you need to know. There won't be a quiz again, I'll show you. Now, basically, it shows three pathways. So the interesting part would be the right part, the right bubbles, where it actually incorporates emotional vulnerability, biological markers, and impulsivity as affecting how someone can develop from a recreational gambler towards a problem gambler, which is the end stage there. This is another way to approach it. But so the way that these personal characteristics, that they don't directly influence gambling. They work through gambling motives and cognitive biases. Most important, I think, is from gambling motives, why do people gamble? And because these are incorporated in the model, it actually tells us a bit more about the function of gambling for that person. I mean, we know that this person is experiencing problems from their gambling, but why do they gamble so much? What does gambling offer them, even in the midst of all these clear problems that they experience? And again, when you look at the research on these subtypes, these three subtypes, is that you see that they actually are different on a lot of variables. There are a couple of limitations, though, on this model as well. So even though it's a very clear theoretical framework, the translation to practice is a bit hard, because a lot of these, for example, emotional vulnerability, well, how are we going to test that? How is a gambling operator going to test if someone is emotional vulnerable, or is primarily gambling for coping motives? So that is an issue. Also, there is overlap, again, between the subtypes, so there's a problem. There's also a problem of, I mean, there's these three very distinct pathways, but in reality, they tend to merge at the end point. So in the end, everyone gambles to forget their problems, mainly their gambling problems. But you know, this one motive in the end sticks out for all subtypes, all pathways. And the model doesn't yet, I feel, take that into account. So an idea would be to see if we can actually merge these frameworks, try to see if they can complement each other and how to do that. So, I mean, this is all quite new. This is a very simple picture, but if you would combine the frameworks of the pathways and the severity, you end up already with a 9 subtype grid. Now, you can obviously increase the complexity of that by, for example, introducing game type preferences. So again, if we take the luck versus the strategy game type preferences, we end up with 18 subtypes. Now, ideally, you know, this is a very simplification of it, but this would give us more information on what we see. It can actually be tested as well, and it gives information on the why question as well, which is important here. So, if that is something that we know, now what? How can we actually use this in our endeavor to promote safe play and prevent problem gambling? Because that is the end goal here. Well, there's a number of ways that this can actually help us in doing that. The first one is that it may help in designing safer player journey. So a typical player journey fluctuates in risky gambling behavior. There's no gambler that never experiences any problems or any risky gambling behavior, but the healthy player fluctuates and comes back to a less risky stage, whilst the right picture here, that is someone who is escalating towards problem gambling. So these would be more like nudges, instead of really hard interventions. And we can actually use the markers of transition that we described earlier in the severity framework as hard markers, hard boundaries. A second way would be, it could help us, is that these we could actually improve on interventions, make them more effective by tailoring them. till now, most of the time we use a one-size-fits-all strategy. So you would get a pop-up during play and stop gambling now. Well, don't really see how that works. So tailored interventions are more effective, especially if we take into account one's motivation to gamble. For example, if we know, this is maybe an ideal end stage, but if we know that someone is mainly playing to distract themselves, to forget about any issues that they're having, you might want to distract that person from gambling and lead that person away. Whilst if we have someone that is mainly playing strategy games to boost confidence and increase arousal instead of downplay arousal, then you might want to incentivize someone by letting them take part in a quiz that they can actually win something that is also educational, for example. And the last point is that when interventions are indeed more effective, then you need less of them. So you have less chance of people dropping out or getting bored or not actually looking at the interventions themselves. And a final, I think, important point here is that knowing how we subtype, knowing what this framework does, actually prevents a black box scenario where we put data in the black box, the machine does its work, and something comes out, and we'll just have to assume that it's true because we don't really know what's happening. Sort of a computer says no scenario, which is really important because it can be annoying at best, but it's really problematic at worst. So to summarize, I'm within my time restriction, that's good. Not all gamblers are equal. There are differences. There are startings of ways in actually to subtype these gamblers, distinct them from each other in a meaningful manner that we can actually understand what's happening as well. This can help us to create tailored interventions, which supposedly, well, what research shows so far are more effective, which helps us to, again, protect the customer, to promote safe play, prevent problem gambling. And the final one I wanted to add here, I think that this is also a great opportunity for industry and academia to work more closely together. I see a lot of, I wouldn't say distrust, but maybe we're cautious of each other for good reasons, I think. But this is, I think, a very good point where it will actually aid when we come together a bit more. From the academia perspective, there's a lot of research done. There's a lot of good ideas, good intentions. There's a lot of knowledge on what we're actually doing. And I think that from the gambling operator perspective, there's been an increased awareness and incentive to actually, protect the player. I mean, to promote safe play, it's better to do that than to actually intervene hard or to do any damage. So yeah, I think that's about it.
And thank you, Leroy. I thought we had another 100 slides to go. But please stay on the stage. Any questions to Leroy? Really, really interesting work. Any questions for Leroy here? Expert. And I have a quick question to you, Leroy. So how does your research inform your work as a therapist and vice versa? Something you can say about that?
Yeah, I think, well, I started out as a therapist and I started my research a bit later on. I think it works vice versa. So to begin with, I started treating problem gamblers, and I quickly found that the means that I had to do so were inadequate. So there was one booklet, there was one therapy way to do it, and then I found that gamblers differed, obviously, as people do, and so that inspired me to look into what is known in research on subtyping gamblers, not treating them as one single group, but as different groups. and vice versa. And I would say that, research is complicated. I mean, even the idea of science is quite complicated. So I see that I think a lot of therapists have very limited time to actually indulge in what is known in the literature on treatment. So I had the luxury of being in between those two worlds. So, yeah.
Bridging those two worlds. Well, congratulations. Hope to see you again in the future. Thank you, Leroy.